So I'm very glad that we have this special chance, and let me swiftly ask you a question, and also you can ask questions via email or Facebook. There is a Facebook page of Rozpravy, so excuse my Czech, or there is an email address rozpravy o médiích @gmail.com, through which you can ask your questions for the online audience, and of course those of you who are here with us tonight, you can ask questions directly, and you don't need to wait for the end of the session. You can ask questions whenever you like. So let me just briefly ask you a question, and let me start with David. David, how did you get to advertising? What is your relationship with advertising? How did you get into this field exactly?
Okay, good. Is this is on? Yes. Okay, good. How did I get to advertising? I was a psychology major in the United States when I was in college, and after a year or two of studying psychology, I realized this is interesting, but I don't want to do this for real. And at the university where I was attending, there was this wonderful internship program in which you could go to New York City for an entire semester. And I found out that one of the internship opportunities was with this national organization that does advertising regulation, that looks to try to get deceptive or misleading advertising changed or off the air. And so it was kind of a strange way to get into the field through the regulatory. It was not a legal organization. It was part of a nationwide organization called the Better Business Bureau. But the people that I worked with there were all former advertising agency people. And I also met some other friends in New York in advertising, and I thought, this is for me. And so when I graduated from university the following year, I applied for a job at every advertising agency in town. I did not get any, which was not uncommon in those days. And I just started doing temporary office work. And one of the jobs that where I was a temporary office worker was at a small public relations agency. And then it went from there. And then I got a job as an assistant account executive at an advertising agency, and then another job and another job. And after 17 years, I was working at a small agency that was part of a very large international conglomerate.
Perfect, thank you. Sandy, I would like to ask you, what was your start in advertising, but also how did your career path develop? Because it's just amazing. So
my education was at the University of Missouri School of Journalism many generations ago. And upon graduation, I studied advertising and marketing, and upon graduation, I ended up going to a company in St. Louis, Missouri called Monsanto, a chemical company. I worked there for 3 years and hated virtually every minute of it, but I learned a lot. I was then recruited to go to J. Walter Thompson, a very famous and very old advertising agency in Chicago, and worked in account services and media, planning and buying. And one of the clients that I had been working with was a soft drink called 7-Up. And one hot July summer day, I received a telephone call from McCann Erickson asking me if I could meet with them to talk about a job internationally. And I met with the president of McCann International, and they offered me a job in Tokyo. I had never traveled anywhere other than one day in Toronto, Canada. But I left with my wife and 3-year-old son, and 3 months later we were in Tokyo. I stayed there for 7 years. I was then promoted to go manage our company in the Philippines, in Manila, at a very interesting time when President Marcos was still there and martial law was in play. And from the Philippines, I was transferred to Hong Kong. I was supposed to go for 3 years and stayed for 9. And then I was transferred to New York and spent 5 years in McCann International, during which time was my first introduction to Prague, into the Czech Republic. I stayed in, and I'll get to that in just a minute, but I stayed in New York for 5 years and was then transferred back to Hong Kong for another 5 years with a sister company of McCann Erickson called Amirati Puris Lentes, and I moved back to Hong Kong as a regional director for Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. My first trip to Prague was in 1991, early 91, when McCann Erickson's clients, Nestle, Unilever, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco International, Coca-Cola, all wanted to move into the Czech Republic. And we opened up an office here, which was an incredible experience. We opened up an office in Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest. But the one here was particularly interesting and very challenging because it was at a point in time when there were many young American students hanging out, just here. If you know where Joe's Cafe is, across the Charles Bridge, and there's the church area, the city center across the bridge. And we ended up hiring a doctor, a lawyer, an architect, and a number of other people that had virtually nothing to do with advertising, but we started an agency at that point in time. My follow-up to that was my youngest son, after graduation from George Washington University, ended up working at McCann Erickson for 5 years. He met his wife there, and he spent 10 years in Prague. And subsequent to that, I have been working with the University of Missouri, trying to figure out what kind of a program we could have overseas. And the University of Missouri signed an agreement with Charles University 16 years ago. And we started a program overseas. I bring every year between 10 and 13 students from Missouri, and we have an equal number from Charles University. And the Missouri students go to a 2-week culture class, and then I have 2 weeks with them. And we work with McCann Erickson, and we actually work on a real brand product. We get a briefing from them. We've worked with Unilever last year, with Asia Breweries, with Kozel. This year is going to be Pilsner Urquell, Vodafone. And we've then, subsequent to that, started a program 7 years ago in Tokyo and 6 years ago in Hong Kong. That's it.
Sandy, thank you so much. It's just amazing journey. We'll get back to it, but let me just ask now, Philip. So we have heard career path from two men who are professionals in advertising. So you represent here the research and teaching. So what interests you most in this field?
Thank you. So I have a little bit of a different path coming through here, and very much less experience when it comes to advertising as a profession. When I was back in the U.S. About 12 years ago, I was still working at, in the U.S. it was called Sovereign Bank, and for the U.S. it was a small bank, about 300 branches. But we were fairly autonomous with advertising, so each branch was in charge of its own promotions and type of community outreach things. So I was allowed to be involved in that, which really, for me, was very exciting and it was interesting. And I enjoyed working with people, but not banking so much. You may not realize this, but it's not as exciting as an industry as it sounds like. So I really started to enjoy teaching and moved to the Czech Republic and continued that after some retraining. And for me, I have my bachelor's in marketing and my master's is in international relations and regional studies and international business. And it was just very exciting for me to be able to put marketing and regional studies together and look at culture. And that's what actually got me into looking at how marketing and generational marketing has been taking off. It's very big in the US and around Europe to be studying generational marketing. And for me, I really was excited to see, because I work with younger students, and most of them are very excited about the world around them. They enjoy reaching out and connecting with the people around them, not just in their own communities, but around the world. And for me, it's interesting to see how they work and how they respond to the marketing media. It's been constantly aimed at them. Many of you, between the time you wake up and the time you go to bed, you are constantly being bombarded with these messages. And these messages are being crafted sometimes by people your own age, but more likely by people older than you. And the way these messages interact with you and how you respond to them, to me, is very interesting. It's based on psychology and sociology and behavioral studies, and so it's very exciting. Trying to understand humans is not always successful, but it's very interesting to do, and it's a very exciting thing to follow. So that's what got me into it, and then coming here and continuing my research is something that makes me very happy. So.
Thank you. Now let me just go back to the 1990s. So both of you, Sandy and David, you were here in the Czech Republic, but David only for a short while. And Sandy, you experienced a longer period back then.
Yes.
Can you just briefly describe to our students, most of them are, you know, just generations younger than us, can you just describe them, how did the advertising market look like in the 1990s when you came?
When I first came here, there were virtually no major advertising agencies in Prague. All of the major global companies were all looking to get into business here in a very active way, because there was, of course, the opportunity of getting started after the revolution ended. And in 1991, at the request of a number of McCann clients, we opened up the office here. We were the first agency that opened up in Prague. The office was in a 4th floor walk-up down near the Powder Tower, down the street from the Palace Hotel. And we ended up, as I mentioned before, looking for staff. We brought in 2 people. We brought a creative director in, and we brought a couple of account people in, and we basically got started with trying to market different brands. And we started out with mostly Unilever, Nestle, and R.J. Reynolds Tobacco International, trying to build the level of brand awareness that these companies needed, because products were just being introduced into the Czech Republic in a very active and very aggressive way. So it was a time of real pioneering days and a very exciting time. Subsequent to that, I had an opportunity to come back to the Czech Republic every year, and we had the wonderful experience of seeing how things would progress from year to year, not only in terms of what Prague was like, but in terms of what the agency business was like. Many of the agencies, such as Leo Burnett and Ogilvy and so on and so forth, they were very prominent and very large at one point in time. Many of them have reduced their size and are not nearly as active. There's one agency that's been here for a very long time called Euro RSCG, which is originally a French agency, and they're still very active here. The others are here, but with much lesser presence.
Thank you. David, can you tell us, I will ask the audience tonight, who of you has seen the Mad Men series? Okay, so about a half, at least a half of you. Okay.
It's real.
David, can you tell us, how was the advertising world in New York City at the time when you worked there?
Okay, so I'm just after the Mad Men period. So by the time, well, I mean, I'm much, much younger than anyone in Mad Men. So I was in the advertising industry in New York in the 1980s and 1990s. And so it was, in fact, past the Mad Men period. There actually were women working in executive positions and creative positions and running agencies, and not only as secretaries. And there were no longer 3-hour lunches where people just went and drank martinis. I did have a boss, when I was like 24, I had a boss who was 27, and I do think he spent every lunch hour doing cocaine. But he was, as far as I could tell, he was pretty much the exception, at least in my agency. It was very competitive, and it was an interesting time. It was an interesting time to be in the agency scene in the 80s and 90s, in that there was so much, it was interesting but not always good. There were so many mergers and acquisitions. Agencies were constantly buying up other agencies. So if you worked at a small independent agency that was doing exciting work, and you went there for that reason, then you could pretty much be assured that within 2 years, the small independent creative agency that you love, because it's small, independent, and creative, would be bought by a large corporate monster. And that kept happening and happening and happening. So, and virtually, I was telling these gentlemen the other day, every place that I worked in New York, except for one, no longer exists. They either went out of business, or more often they were acquired by big national, and then in the 90s especially by big international firms, including those who have presences here. And the last place I worked at was a wonderful, smaller agency. Almost all of the clients there were in the toy and game industry. And I had worked on toys and games at other agencies before. So much of my career was doing children's advertising, was doing TV commercials geared toward children or their parents. So it was a lot of fun. And it was a relatively small agency that served some large clients like Milton Bradley and Parker Brothers, and has any game that you ever played, I would bet as a child, I worked on the American campaign for it. And maybe even some games you've played as adults, like Scrabble or Jenga or Pictionary or Trivial Pursuit. And that agency, of course, was acquired by a medium-sized American agency, which was then itself acquired by a massive conglomerate with a name that almost sounds like a joke. Omnicom it was almost like a parody of itself, a corporation that actually sounds like the name of a comic book villain or an evil planet. Which is kind of frankly how I thought about it. So it was an exciting time to be there, but you never knew, frankly, if the place that you knew and loved was going to be acquired by a big corporate Omnicom monster.
Thank you for that. And Philip, you've been here quite a while in the Czech Republic. Can you tell us what were the first impressions of the advertising market, or generally about the Czech human nature when you came here?
So I think I had a fairly typical first reaction to Czech television. I was like, this is very, very different than what I'm used to. And most of the things that seemed new on television still looked like they were being produced in the 1980s. Sorry. I still, because I've got little kids, I still watch all the newest fairy tales, and even those are still looking pretty far behind the curve when it comes to production. But the stories are nice. I'll tell you one of the big differences you'll see between this kind of advertising and this kind of media between here and the US, and my wife is very happy to point that out all the time, is that in the US, someone has to die immediately in every kid's show, and then in the Czech Republic, we don't have that problem. So anything that's for kids here is actually for kids, and in the US, they're just kind of inserting trauma at the very beginning to make the rest seem nice. Advertising here is very interesting in that it's still very silly. A lot of the biggest campaigns we've seen in the last few years, I don't remember his name, but he's got the crazy white hair. He was on the dancing show too, and he made it almost to the finals. Nobody can help me. Yeah, there you go. He was really big for radio advertising, and then there was the Dašci Fofola, if everyone remembers that one, the little chihuahua for Kofola. And like that, those kinds of ads do really well here, and they're very nice, and they're family friendly, and they're not like too in your face. And in the U.S., we tend towards more dramatic or more very almost like Hollywood, in the way that they have to be very impactful and very aggressive and catch your attention. So it's different. It's not good or bad different. It's just very different in that the U.S. we have this big budget Hollywood mentality for everything, and so everything has to be dramatic and have purpose and be very deep. And we don't see as many of these silly, catchy campaigns as often, and they do very well here. I'm happy to see that kind of thing. So, and it does fit with the Czech mentality, because you guys, you come off as unfriendly in the beginning, but you aren't that way. It's just a front. You don't want people to come up and be friendly to you, and I understand that, because people aren't always wonderful, but once you get past that, it's a very nice place to be. As I know, I've been here 12, 13 years, so, all right.
Yeah, so you're almost native Czech then. Okay, let me ask David, if we say American advertising, a lot of the people just don't know, or some of them watch the Super Bowl advertising. How would you describe what is actually American advertising shortly to you?
Wow. It's changed a lot. America, and this certainly piggybacks with what Philip was just saying. American advertising, let's say American television advertising, I'll start with that. American television advertising in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s was very much about selling products, features, and benefits. Here's what it does, and here's why you will like it. And it was very straightforward and frankly boring, but clear in its communication. Like, here's why you should wash your clothes with this laundry soap. Here's why this toothpaste is better for your teeth than the other toothpaste. So very straightforward, and especially in categories like laundry soap and toothpaste, the advertising was as boring as the products are. That did start changing very much, I would say. Well, I mean, really started changing in the late 60s. And by the 80s, certainly you could find exciting and creative advertising even when the product was not. Now, I think that the creative revolution, as it was called, I think is fairly complete. I mean, at least in American advertising now, regardless of the product and regardless of whether the product itself is boring, like insurance or soap, the advertising is not. The advertising can't be. It has to connect with you emotionally. It has to make you feel. It has to make you feel excited about it. But more often, what so much of American advertising, and to my mind, Czech advertising as well. I mean, to the degree that I can. You know, I have a television in my room here, and I turn it on, and I don't understand much of it, but whenever I can, I turn on the Czech subtitles as well, which sometimes helps. And my impression of the television advertising here is that it's very similar. It may have not even existed, really. Sandy, you were saying like in '91 it didn't exist, and my sense is that it probably evolved very quickly. I mean, relatively speaking.
Much of it was imported.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say that a lot of American advertising now is not about telling you about the product or even what it will do for you or why you need it, but rather it tells a story. It allows you to see how you will be happier, how your life will be better if you use the product. And I think one of the categories where it's easy, beer advertising, certainly in the United States, and I suspect here as well. I mean, whereas a toothpaste commercial can tell you which ingredients it has and how it will prevent you from getting cavities, a beer advertisement has never told you how drunk it will get you and how relaxed you will be, and how because it can't. At least in my country, there are rules against talking about. We can advertise alcohol, but we can't tell you why you would actually use it. But what we can show you is presumably how great your life will be when you do. Look at all the people that you'll meet, especially people that you want to date. Look at how much fun you will have. Look at how popular you will be. Look at how happy you will be. I'm not going to tell you anything about my product. I will just let you picture your life with my product in your life, and then you get to infer that, oh yeah, I need this to be happy, even without me telling you what it does.
Thank you. Sandy, you remember the first big involvement of American advertising here in the Czech Republic. Can you elaborate more on this? What, from your point of view, what was the American influence on Czech advertising?
Coca-Cola, for example, was imported into the Czech Republic, and it was, as David mentioned, they were brand messages. The efficacy of a brand. Coca-Cola talked about things go better with Coke, talking about Coke with food. It was very simple, very straightforward advertising. As you say, pretty much boring. There were different categories that were being brought into the Czech Republic, for example, with L'Oreal, with hair care products for women, with Nestle, with different coffee products, and so on and so forth. Very straightforward, very uncomplicated, but it was the origin of those relationships were very important to both the agency and the client, because they were able to communicate brand messaging to a population that was not very familiar with a lot of activities that had taken place before. I think that the agency business, there were some agencies here in the late in the late 40s, early 50s, but anything compared to what it was like in the early 90s and progressing to what it is today.
And can I ask you one more question? Can you tell us more what were the changes in the business, not only in the Czech Republic but worldwide, in the advertising business that happened together with the digital revolution?
Most of my experience in managing an agency has been on the business side, working with clients and trying to ensure that we had a bottom line financial success. Every year I had to report back to New York, hopefully with a profitable agency, with a profitable bottom line. And it was fairly simple 20, 25, 30 years ago. It was very easy because typically agencies would charge their client 15%. They paid a commission of 15%. And it was usually lucrative, and a lot of agencies were very profitable at that time. But over the years, clients began to say, we want to do more, but we're only going to pay less. As a result of the competitiveness in the agency business, they were really trying to nail the agencies down for lower profits. And I was talking to Denisa about something yesterday and mentioned to David earlier. Most companies today have what's called a procurement department. And a procurement department started off usually, and in many ways still today, would buy things like stationery and raw products for production and so on and so forth. But because of the competitiveness of agencies and because clients were looking for better deals for less money, they turned over the buying and negotiating process to the procurement department. And this has caused a huge strain on client and agency relationships because in actual fact, most of the procurement departments know very little about branding and marketing. They're there to negotiate money. And as a result of that, unfortunately, a lot of the marketing activities are being taken away, the negotiating and marketing activities are being taken away from the brand groups, and the brand groups are the ones that interface with the agency, so it's becoming a very complicated process. I spent some time a couple of days ago with some people at McCann Erickson, and they're under this kind of pressure every day. Fortunately, they have got great relationships with their clients, and they are very profitable. Another thing that's happening today, and David mentioned this earlier, that a lot of the agencies, smaller agencies, were being bought up by large conglomerates. McCann Erickson, for example, is owned by a holding company called the Interpublic Group of Companies. And the demands of clients in these times, certainly for the last 10 years and even more so today, is that things are done so quickly in the social networking environment in which we live. The ability to communicate a brand message is not very easy today. As a result of that, companies like McCann Erickson went out and bought vertical corporations, they PR companies, and creative agencies, creative small shops, because they could not afford to provide the kind of service that a lot of clients are looking for. So the conventions of radio, magazine, television, newspaper, the era in which I grew up in the agency business has changed so much. But I can tell you that it's right now one of the most exciting places in terms of a career that you could ever select.
Certainly is, but it's also hard to keep up for the teachers. How to explain to the students? Philip, can you elaborate on this more?
Sure. So one of the things, as they mentioned over here, it's very difficult for companies to really assess how well marketing and PR is working. Originally, they would say, we hired your firm, our sales increased, you did well. And today, there is so much more to it. First, you can't just look at return on investment with sales because it doesn't work. In the beginning of the internet age, you could say how many people visited your web page, and still some pages still have a little counter how many people visited, and you'll see it just scrolling. And I think everyone in this room knows that the number of people visiting your page means almost absolutely nothing. I mean, half those people are probably like, oh, I clicked on the wrong link. And so they're trying to get these metrics to be more consistent and to be more accurate. And trying to explain this to people, it's very difficult. They started looking more at clicks, and now they talk about click-through, which means I clicked on your website, and then once I was there, I actually interacted with some things that are happening. And once you can measure those, you start thinking, okay, if they interacted with at least a few things, it probably led to at least brand awareness and brand engagement, and at best, some kind of call to action, which would be requesting more information or buying something or sharing, whatever it is that this website is trying to get you to do. So when you're trying to teach these things, it's people say, well, okay, so how can you be successful? And the problem is, what is success? Okay, what is success? Your company, if you are a company owner or if you work in the promotion of a company, you have to be very clear with your goals. What is success? So very often I have to explain to students and say, look, this is when when you're trying to do this, you have to be goal-oriented. Are you trying to improve brand awareness? So do you want more people clicking on your website or looking for search terms? Or are you looking for requests for free samples or requests for more information? Or are you looking for shares? Are you looking for increases in followers or likes? You know, there are so many different things depending on where your company is in its life cycle that you might consider success. There's a rumor there's a famous statistic that like 50% of all, or it's actually closer to 80% of all new businesses fail. And it's depending on who you ask, that really isn't true, because a lot of people say, well, 80% of new businesses fail, but some of the people who say that, they consider anything less than $1 million in sales in your first year as failure. And I'll be honest, if I start a new business and I get $900,000 in sales in the first year, I probably won't be crying at the end of the day unless I'm selling Ferraris, in which case I have done a bad job. So when you consider what success and failure is, you have to be very clear with your goals. And that's where a lot of this, especially for these newer generations coming up, you have a much better idea of what it means to have a successful online presence. And a lot of these companies need this kind of education. They have older generations in charge. They are not as familiar with what it really means to be successful online. And these digital campaigns, which are absolutely taking over. In fact, for the first time in history, I think we're going to start seeing digital ad revenue higher than television ad revenue, which is a huge shift in the advertising world. And that's you. That's you who are going to be in charge of acclimating people to this and explaining what it means and helping promote these programs and make people aware of how it works.
Thank you. Well, I will add up with a question from the audience, and I will motivate all of you. If you have any question, don't be afraid to raise your hand or write it on social media. So there is a question from our international student from Korea that the current trend is performance marketing, which is based on big data. So this is a global trend, but how can we work on this trend with countries with a smaller population, which have smaller data, and for example, it's much more expensive also to adapt, for example, localize to the language, which is such a difficult language as Czech language surely is, or they don't have such a sophisticated data for social media. So what would be your take on the performance marketing and its use in smaller countries, not big markets such as US?
Performance is very difficult to measure, and clients are very insistent on the delivery of performance. And it's causing, because of the multiplicity of different types of communication, agencies are struggling to figure out how to respond to clients. You were talking about click-through, and being able to measure a return on investment is a major challenge for agencies today. As far as I'm concerned, I've been spending time with McCann Erickson. They struggle through this all the time, and it's always a debatable issue as to how successful an investment's going to be.
And I think there's an interesting paradox going on here, because one thing we haven't talked about yet, but we probably should, so I'll talk about it now. Okay, so most of my strategic communication career was in fact in advertising, but I did do a little bit of public relations. I think Sandy, yours was it entirely advertising? But I'm assuming 100% advertising. And that's one of the major ways that the world of strategic communication has changed. Almost every agency does advertising and public relations and digital and social, and maybe direct marketing and sales promotion. The world has become more integrated, and agencies have become more integrated. They have to be able to offer all of those strategic communication services, and they recognize, and this is something that's been going on for several decades, that none of those different disciplines or none of those different platforms or forms of marketing or strategic communication can or should work by itself. So there's a whole lot more, let's say, for example, so when I was in advertising agencies in New York in the 1980s and 1990s, Every once in a while, we would have a meeting that involved the public relations agency. Every once in a while, the client would say to us, hey, you know, you really need to talk to our PR agency, which was a separate company, and find out what they're doing. Every once in a while, we would have a meeting in which the ad agency was there, the PR agency was there, the brand new digital marketing agency was there, the et cetera, et cetera. That does, for the most part, that doesn't happen now. Everyone does everything, or every agency has to do everything, and clients recognize that those different forms of strategic communication have to work together, and that's a good thing. At the same time, and this goes, Sandy, to your point, at the same time, many of those other forms are the ones that are harder, other than advertising, are the ones that are harder to measure. Public relations has always been notoriously hard to measure in terms of return on investment, or does public relations move product? Well, maybe, but the problem is also is that no one consumer is exposed only to public relations. We are all always exposed to advertising and PR and tweets and the website and events. So being able to, it's strange. We're more sophisticated technologically, and I think we know less about how to measure the performance of what we're achieving.
Can I just add one comment to this? What David is saying is really, it's the root of the situation today. The whole area of communications right now is integration. Because when you look at what clients are demanding, it used to be very simple. If they wanted a television commercial, if they wanted event marketing, if they wanted media buying and so on and so forth, it was very simple for an agency to do it. Right now, the demands on an agency to be able to provide all of this and to provide measurements for each of those disciplines is incredibly difficult. The main reason this is also challenging is because of the change in the consumer. In the way the consumer buys, the way the consumer receives messages, and the swiftness of how quickly you make a decision, a buying decision, has caused a multiple of challenges for both the clients and agencies.
Well, yeah, Philip, you focus on Generation Z, on young people. We tend to think, and they might think, that they live only in an online world. Do you think that you can get by only with digital marketing, which, if it is aimed on Generation Z?
I think obviously it's very difficult to just stick to one type of marketing. Digital marketing is the future, but we'll always need this terrestrial marketing of billboards outside, although they're becoming digital now too. But the idea of television and radio, it still reaches a vast audience. If I can digress for 1 second though, the question also was asking about how smaller companies, I think, would kind of fight in this larger world. And if you have good support from the people in your agency, if you have people who understand the audience, you have a chance to reach people, especially because we have access to medium like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook that have such large audiences that if you know how to, and YouTube also, and there are many others that I'm too old to touch, like TikTok and things like that. But if you have people who understand how to use this, then being a smaller group or a smaller audience or a smaller company, it's not as big as disadvantage. You're not fighting just on dollars. You're not just fighting for, if you have these large advertising events and you're going up against a McCann Erickson, you might think, wait, we're 10 people, we can't do it. They're working for companies that can throw millions of dollars into advertising. And yes, they will beat you in areas like television and radio, but if you can put together good online presence, your electronic word of mouth can make up for that shortfall in range. And we've seen that time and again where a couple of well-placed tweets, a couple of well-placed pictures on Instagram can make a huge difference in the initial stages of a campaign. And at that point, you are on equal footing with a lot of these larger groups. And so I think that's where with this question, if you can understand your audience, so if you have a smaller market, if you're from a smaller country and you can't afford big data, which is very expensive, you have to look at your local market and find experts, find people who know the ground, find people who understand the people. And that doesn't have to mean young, it just has to mean people who are more open-minded or who have studied culturally the people you're trying to reach. So don't think that big money is the only way to get a hold of these people. Big data is, of course, useful. The information is power. The more you know about people, the easier it is to understand them and to motivate them. But it's not, if you don't have this, you can't do it. You just have to be more creative. You have to find ways in. If you go into a Czech market, which is not a huge market even in Europe, you know, you have to find ways to get into the hearts of the people so that they'll spread the message. I mean, if I was going to try some kind of viral marketing campaign, I would just have, you know, secret hunting locations for the best mushrooms, and I would know that people are going to start spreading the ideas because they'll be like, oh my God, I know this. This is mushrooms. We can care about this. Spread it to your friends. Shh, don't tell anyone, which is the greatest way to spread something if it's a secret. And so smaller companies do have a chance to get back into that. And I'm sorry, so coming back to how Generation Z, refresh my memory, please. I'm sorry. It's
If the young people are only online, or if advertising works also offline for them, in your opinion?
Thank you. Sorry. So excited about the other topic. You can definitely perform offline, even with Generation Z. Many of them will say, no, I don't watch television, but they do. They watch it, although even if it's just, you know, noise in the room, they are listening to the radio, you are watching television, or you have younger people in your house and they're watching television and you can't get away from it. When you're walking through many of the buildings and in restaurants, you're exposed to it peripherally. When you go to airports, you have the news, you have other programs being shown to you. You know, many of you are so used to multitasking that these things happen subconsciously for you at this point. You don't pay attention to it, but the brain catches everything. So whether you want it to or not, you're paying attention to these things. So getting to Generation Z is not just an online medium. It's not just something that is on Twitter, on Instagram. It is not just social media. Terrestrial media still matters, and it still reaches people in a very comfortable way. Many of you know your old movies, your old TV shows, and they mean something to you. And so watching them on TV, watching Popelka at Christmas matters, and seeing the ads during that is going to have, you know, an effect. So plus you're going to talk to people who also watch television. So it definitely has an impact. You can't just be 100% online and expect to do really well in the world today.
Thank you.
But also, of course, I'm assuming, maybe I should just ask you all, do you, okay, maybe raise your hand if you actually spend more than 1 hour a week watching a television set, like an actual TV? A few people, all right?
Not because it's connected to your computer.
No, I mean an actual television, like in your living room, like a piece of furniture. Or on top of another piece of furniture. How many of you spend time watching television programs on your computer or on your phone or on your tablet? Whether it's through YouTube or the television network's websites or Hulu. Okay, so that's the thing too. Or, for example, so even if spending time with a television set, a piece of furniture, is not a part of your life, my assumption is you're still being exposed to television content. Even if spending time with a physical newspaper is not something that you do, I hope and assume that you read news on news websites. And some of those news websites, of course, are the digital side of a print vehicle, and some are not, right? Even if you don't spend time with a physical magazine, I'm assuming that many of you read magazines online. So, I mean, that's the thing too, of course, the lines are blurred. So yes, you know, at least certainly in America, I imagine everywhere, yes, television advertising revenues are down, and certainly newspaper and magazine are down. Radio, not so much necessarily, but you're still being exposed to television programming and the advertising that supports it when you're looking at your other devices. So it's, you know, it's the lines are blurry.
Well, we've been talking a lot about these changes in the business and changes in advertising world as well. What does it mean for employment? Just imagine there is about, I don't know, 70, 80 of young people, and about 80% of them would like to be employed soon. How did the employment change in the advertising world in the past 10 years?
I'm glad you asked that question, because it's a phenomenon that is occurring every day and causing a challenge for both small and large agencies. Because of the nature of the consumer and the nature of the communications messaging, it's presented a challenge mostly to advertisers in terms of being able to select the kind of agency vehicle to communicate on their behalf. And as a result of the changing consumer and the digital age in which we live in, it's caused a huge amount of challenge for companies like McCann Erickson, which are giant corporations that have mostly globally aligned clients like Unilever, Nestle, Coca-Cola, and so on. But then you also have a multiple of many in the Czech Republic, a lot of regional, and many, many local clients that want to advertise and want to do it digitally and want to spend a lot less money. So the choice, one of the reasons why many of the big agencies have disappeared is that they just could no longer afford to compete in the marketplace because clients were paying so little money. So many of the smaller agencies are doing well, which leads me into the point about employment. I would still encourage you, if you want to go into the agency business, to look at companies like McCann Erickson, because McCann is the #1 agency here, and the managing director, I talked to him the other day, they're looking for good people all the time. But I will also tell you that there are many of the smaller companies, the smaller agencies, that have staffing anywhere from 5 to 50 people that are also looking for quality people. And you can make a lot of money in a small agency as a new graduate and in a career. One of the things that's happening in small agencies is that if they decide to keep their staffing low, what they've mostly decided to do is to go out and hire freelance. And that's another possibility to look at as a writer, as an art director, as a media buyer, or whatever, because basically you can charge whatever the market bears. You can charge whatever you want to charge a client or an agency. So there are many, many different conglomerations of activities that exist today in the area of agency business. There's also something that you might want to look into if you're interested in marketing, and that's brand management. Working for a large corporation such as Vodafone or Unilever or Nestle, because those are the kinds of companies that you can really stay with for a career. In the agency business, switching from one agency to the other happens all the time. So.
Thank you. David, your graduates, what are they mostly aiming for? What are they wishing for in their career?
Oh, thanks, sir. Okay, so my graduates at the University of New Mexico.
Yeah.
So I live in a small city. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which has like 600,000 people. So it's, let's say, half the size of Prague. It doesn't have any large agencies, but it has a lot of small ones. Every agency in Albuquerque and in other smaller cities in America, but also even in places that are like mid-sized cities like Denver or Austin, Texas, or I'm thinking of like the places where my students go if they don't want to stay in New Mexico. The agencies, as I was mentioning before, do everything. And so they look to hire people who can do everything. And so this is a challenge because, yes, the world has changed, and obviously, especially as evidenced by everyone in this room and maybe everyone in the technological world, especially if you're below the age of 30, your life is digital. Your life is not spent with print media and not even so much with broadcast media. That said, and I can swear to this myself, there are still people in the world who are older than 30, right? In fact, on the stage, there are at least 2 of us who are older than 30. And so if you're going to work for an agency, even though you live in a digital world, people like you are not the only consumer that the message has to go to. Even if you never watch television, you might still have to know how to create a television commercial. Even if you never read a newspaper, you might still need to know how to produce a newspaper ad. Even if you've never done public relations, you'll have to learn it. You might already be ready to go on web design and social media and other 21st century technologies, but most of the larger agencies and many of the smaller ones do everything. They still do print and TV and radio and digital and social and design websites. So my students are finding that they get hired if they can do everything, and if they're flexible. And even though they might, even if they might feel much more comfortable doing digital strategic communication right out of college, as long as they show a willingness, I'll learn print, I'll learn TV. I recognize, agency, that you probably have some clients that are still doing print and broadcast as well as digital and social. So that's a big part of it too, is being open and this is always an issue too, and I can say this having been an agency person. When I was at agencies in New York City, I think all of my colleagues and I, we just assumed, or we had to be reminded by our clients who were not in New York City, they were in small towns and small cities elsewhere, who were always getting upset with us. They would say, we would present a campaign and they would say, this campaign feels like it was created for 25-year-olds living in New York. In other words, people just like you. The target audience is not only 25 years old living in New York. I imagine that the target audience for Czech strategic communication, not everyone who's going to buy your product lives in Prague.
In Letná, specify.
In Letná, or in Karlín. But Karlín seems to be the place to get these jobs, right? Not everyone lives in Karlín or in Letná. Not everyone lives in Prague. Not everyone is 25. So you have to be willing and able to talk to people who are like your parents, because they still buy things, right? Your grandparents, if they're alive, they still buy things too. I hope. At the very least, they're buying food, I hope. So that's part of it as well, is being aware that even though the world has changed, it hasn't changed entirely. And media have not changed. Like, there is still such a thing as television. I watch it every day, right?
But David, can you please talk more about it? Because this brings enormous pressure on us as teachers.
Sure.
How to educate the young generation. Can you talk more about
that is a challenge, because I teach strategic communication classes in my home university, and I'm teaching one here. And I want to also say thank you to the many people I see from my class. Hi. Thank you for coming. It is really a challenge. And actually, in truth, and this may be either lazy or smart on my part or both, I allow you all to, in all seriousness, I allow you all to teach me. My assumption is, like, even if it's a brand that I'm familiar with, I may not be as familiar with what the given, like, let's say, I don't know, Ford, Mercedes-Benz, right? Nike. I am certainly familiar with these brands, and I am probably somewhat more likely to, in my day-to-day life, to see what they're doing on television or in print, although I'm online all the time as well. I'm probably more likely to see what those brands are doing in the more traditional media, so I will rely on you to tell me what their website looks like. I will rely on you to tell me which different social media they're in, and that helps. I mean, and it also, and even if I don't ask you to, you will do it anyway. I had, half of my class the other day gave presentations, and your presentations, some of them included, you were showing me what the clients you chose to talk about are doing on, in their television advertising, but also in their social media and their websites. And so I will very often rely, as well as just having to keep myself educated. But a big part of my education comes from my students, I'll be honest. And also a lot of my students do internships or have jobs at agencies, especially or including digital agencies, and I'll talk to them and I'll find out what they're up to.
Thank you. Now, Sandy, you teach at the summer school here in Prague. What is the most important?
Well, the word you just used is the one I wanted to talk about for a moment in terms of a phenomenon that you're all, I'm sure, familiar with, and that's called an internship. And I think that internships, certainly in the U.S., present an enormous challenge to students. I think it is less of a challenge, at least from my experience, probably less of a challenge, because internships in the Czech Republic, from what I understand, are much more prevalent when you're going to school, and you can use them, you can get them, you can be employed, and you can earn money. One of the challenges in the States, and I was in Columbia, Missouri at the university several weeks ago. Typically, you're looking at a 4-year education, and when you get into about 3.5 years, you start thinking about where do I want to work and who's going to hire me, because I'm going to be graduating in May and I want a full-time job. The chances in the States, at least in my experience, looking at several of the universities, the University of Missouri in particular, is that graduating with a full-time position, being hired in a full-time position, is almost negligible to zero. I met with about 50 different students a couple of weeks ago, and out of that number of students, only one was offered a full-time job. The rest were all offered internships that would last either from 3 to 6 months, and they paid virtually nothing, not even transportation or lunch money. And effectively what the students were being told is, you're being given an opportunity, and at the end of 3 months we may say, come on, join us. At the end of 6 months, join us, or at the end of 6 months, thank you, but no thank you. So it's a real problem. And when you stop to think about the time, the effort, and the financial burden that your parents have borne in trying to educate you, and then going out and trying to get a job is really difficult. But I would tell you that if I were in your situation, I would be very adamant about the fact that you provide added value to any company that you're going to work with. And I would let them know that you're much better than an intern, that you offer a lot more, and I would be very, very strong in your communications about that and being able to sell yourself, because your value to a company is immeasurable, in my opinion.
Yeah. Sandy, this certainly doesn't count for my Czech students, because they ask for much higher, for example, salary than I have. So, Philip, can you add on this?
I hope so. So one of the things, especially what these guys have already spoken about, it is you have a much higher rate of students working in the field that they actually want to work in while they're in school here than we have in the U.S. One of the things that we have available here that does make a very big difference is Erasmus programs. So if you've been or if you have had the chance to go on Erasmus for work study or something, I do recommend it. At the very least, you're not. If you do Erasmus work study, you can find out what you don't like about work. You can find companies that you think you're getting into a decent situation, and you realize that maybe this is not what you want. As all of us up here have known, except maybe Sandy, who's been with McKenna forever, when you change jobs, which most of us will do in our lifetimes, you learn not just what you enjoy, but what you don't like and what you look for in the places that you're looking for. Many of us, or many of you, when I sit with you in interviews and I ask you what you want to do, it's like, I want to have my own business. Okay, great. What do you want to do? I don't know. Well, okay, maybe start with what you love and then try to build a business around that. But a lot of what you're learning here are skills that you can take into a job for yourself if you wanted to start your own business, or that you would be very useful, you would be very valuable to a larger corporation or even a small startup. If you know your worth, which hopefully you will learn while you're going through your education, you'll see what you can do and what you can't do and what you can learn to do, and be open about that. When you go and speak to companies, say, I'm very good at this and I'm very interested in learning how to do these things. Show them that you have the desire to improve yourself, and they'll be like, okay, so now you're not an interviewee, you're an investment. You're someone that we think we can take and mold into what we want, which is what every company wants, is little people who do exactly what they tell them to do. And they'll be willing to help walk you through that. And after a few years, or even after 1 year, you may decide okay, thank you, this has been a great opportunity. I'm going to take these skills and move them into a different area. It may go from advertising to public relations. Maybe you enjoy digital communications more. Maybe you find out that while you've been creating these campaigns, you're like, you know what, I think I want to be in front of the camera for a few of these, and end up in something else. Maybe you end up in journalism somewhere. But these are all things that you will discover about yourselves through education, hopefully with your teachers encouraging you to try these new things. And everyone here, I think, makes their students do presentations, so you have to get up and do a little speaking on your own, which I know you love. And you'll find these things. So hopefully you will find a little bit of yourself through education and in work. When you first get out there, don't be afraid to try new things. Don't be afraid to take those skills somewhere else. It's always nerve-wracking when you are like, okay, I don't really like it here, but I'm scared to change. Change it works. Change is good. It happens. Okay? Don't be afraid of that.
David mentioned something which has been very important for me, and that is how much he learns from his students. I have the honor, privilege, and opportunity to work with both Czech and American students every summer. And at the beginning of the 2 weeks that I spend with them, it's interesting because we start off on a Monday, and it's amazing to listen to the students expound upon how much they don't know. They don't know what they don't know, but how much they begin learning and integrating between the two groups of students after 2 or 3 days. And I am, every year, we have had 100% success, and every year I am absolutely blown away by the intelligence and the versatility and the knowledge and the experience of the students that I'm having the opportunity to work with. It's a real privilege, and to your point, Philip, you'll be amazed at what you're capable of doing, even though you may not realize it until you start doing it. It's a wonderful experience to go through.
Okay, now I think this is the time to ask questions, because I'm sure you'll have many.
Hi, I would like to ask you about, it's more like an economic/marketing question about the European market, and how is it seen like in like Asian brands' eyes and like US brands' eyes, because I'm not seeing many Asian brands like expanding to Europe like aggressively, so I don't know if it is like because the language and culture barriers here are like so big, or like the segment here is so like differentiated. So I would like to ask you about that.
Well, I'm going to try. No, I'll give this to Sandy in a minute. But it's funny when I think of Asian brands. I mean, at least ones that are worldwide brands are the two categories that came to mind immediately were cars and personal electronics, right? So whether it's Hyundai, Honda, Toyota, Mitsubishi, are those brands here?
I was more like thinking about this like startups and things like the brand new Asian brands that are really popping off in Asia are not really visible here in Europe like at all. So I'm just curious about that.
Oh, okay, all right. I can't comment.
Well, not living here, I'm not sure I can, intelligently answer your question, but I can tell you that. Let me just deal with the major brands and how they work. I'll give you an example with Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola will advertise a brand all over the world based on a single concept, based on a single strategy that might be developed in Atlanta. And they would take that strategy and transfer it around the world. I'll give you an example going from, let's say, from the UK, from Atlanta, Georgia to London, to the British market. They would probably run very similar creative and really have a very similar brand messaging. However, when you take that simple strategy that's developed in Atlanta and you move it to Japan, you will have completely different creative. And trying to answer your question, I think that one of the reasons for the lack of maybe multiple Asian brands advertising in Europe is the ability to communicate strategically on a different basis. How you strategically communicate in Japan, the standard television commercial in Tokyo in the Japanese marketplace is 15 seconds. It's amazing how much you can sell in 15 seconds, but to try to communicate something like that in the Czech Republic in 15 seconds, I think would be a real challenge. So I think unless you're dealing with broad-based automobiles and food products, I think it probably is not going to be very prevalent to have major Asian companies advertise in Europe.
Thank you.
That would be my guess.
You're also going to find there's going to be big barriers to entry to Europe when you're looking at startups in Japan or South Korea. What they're going to do is they're going to look for much more commonalities between South Korea, Japan, heading down into Vietnam, and if they do end up successful, you'll see them branch out and look for the Chinese market, which is much larger, and it's much closer to home. Once they start reaching into Europe, you're looking at much larger costs for transportation, and if they enter the EU, you've got much higher regulation. So those are big barriers to entry. And then that's not even getting into cultural problems and language difficulties that they're just not used to. So for startups specifically, unless it's a website that or something that can be strictly online, you're not going to be able to do too much by immediate reaching from Far East Asia into Europe. That's the same reason something that starts up big here is going to circulate through the EU before it's going to head into Asia. It's just a lot of logistics and regulation and cultural miscommunications. So
there are Czech brands that are now being advertised in Europe, in Asia, and one example is KATZ. KATZ is being introduced into the Korean market. The KATZ, Pilsner Urquell, KATZ, Gambrinus is now owned by a company called Asia Breweries. It's a Japanese company, and the Czech companies are trying to figure out how to best sell their products in Asia. For example, KATZ being sold in Korea is being sold with an add-on of cinnamon, if you can believe that. Drinking beer with cinnamon is something that I'm sure you haven't heard of. I hadn't, but it's very prevalent. On the other hand, you have companies like in China, there's a company called Haier, H-A-E-I-E-R, which is they make washing machines, dryers, televisions. They are very active in Europe, and they're very active in the United States. It really depends upon the mentality of the company and how aggressive they want to be globally.
It's a shame we don't have a special Rozpravy with Sandy about talking about the Asian market. I would love to do that next time, definitely. But it's time for your questions now.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, you talked at the beginning about that the advertising is not just for young people and it's not just digital. So I have a question. Why advertising and marketing agencies only hire people between the age of 25 and 30, I'd say?
Good question. Nobody wants to answer that.
Well, they're cheap. No, in all seriousness. It's frankly, it's the same, at least in the American university system. It's like in the American university system, you hire assistant professors, you don't hire full professors. It's part of it. There tend to be more openings. Well, people who are older do move from agency to agency, but I think there really is a bias. And I found this as well when I was in the industry. It's like, at least when it was rare, and this was even 20 years, it was rare to see someone above the age of 40 in an agency unless they were the owner. You just sort of go away. It's sort of like, I think this is a problem, and I think the industry acknowledges it, that there is a prejudice within the industry, but I think in a lot of creative industries as well, probably also similarly in fashion or interior design or architecture, that there is a prejudice toward younger people, or the feeling that, well, once you get above a certain age, you're no longer creative. These are stereotypes that I think are not true. Once you get above a certain age, you're no longer creative, you're no longer inventive, you no longer pay attention to what's happening in culture, you're not on top of trends, you have no fresh ideas, you're stuck in a rut, and you're more expensive. So,
if I may, I would absolutely agree with that and say that you would also see the idea of freshness. You know, a lot of people, they would think, okay, you're 30, 40, your days of innovation have already hit. Your best ideas are probably behind you. So what they're looking for is this new blood, these new ideas, and obviously there are exceptions to the rule, but if you can rent, 30 new hires versus the salary of one established professional, you're probably going to have just reaching for new ideas and new blood. Because even if it doesn't work out, you've at least heard new ideas and come from new directions, and you can work with that on your own. So it can be very much a bit of bias there. So,
Go ahead.
Although there is a logic to it. I mean, in general, trends in any field, right? Trends start with younger people and move up, right? Trends start with typically, I mean, trends, well, let's see, in America, trends tend to start with younger people, people who are not members of the majority group. Like trends start on the fringes and work their way in, right? So I mean, in fairness, I don't think a lot of trends, let's say in fashion, or in advertising, or in design, or in web design necessarily start with people who are 50 or 60. So there is a logic, I think. The assumption is, well, if you're 25, and this may be fair, if you're 25, you're going to be more in touch with the trends in society, with things that are new, with things that are changing. That may well be true, right? So there may be something to that. That said, I think a good agency is an agency that has a balance between people who are, let's say, are 25 and who are fresh and new and in touch with the trends, and people who are 50 who have experience and who've had training. There's a lot of value to that, you know? I think you need both. You need freshness and you need experience. And if you're 25, you don't have a whole lot of work experience.
You know, I think it's very important to know what you're capable of doing and what your interests are. If you want to be an art director, if you want to be a media buyer, an account executive, or whatever the case may be, it's important to know that early on. However, I would say that if I were looking for an agency position right now, if I were looking for a career in the agency, I would want to be a strategic planner. The reason that's important is that if you take a look at all the disciplines in an agency, nothing gets started until you really and truly know what the client wants to do, what they want to achieve. And a strategic planner is like the hub of a wheel, because they're the ones that gather all the information and disseminate that through the agency. And the importance of that position is that kind of it can carry you through much longer, well beyond the age of 35, because you will always be of immense value to the agency. So think about strategic planning. It's great, and it pays better than anything else.
Thank you. Next question. If you're like feeling, you know, we are too old for the advertising world, I'm sure you're still too young for the academia world.
So hello, I have always been wondering, how do people in ad agencies cope with the deadlines and constant time pressure, pushy clients, rejection of their ideas, and these beauties?
With difficulty.
Besides cocaine.
It's life you lead. I mean, it's what you live every single day. Client want things today or yesterday, and you've got to be prepared to deliver. And one of the things that, not one of the things, it was the major thing that we did as an advertising agency was to always plan carefully. We would meet with our clients at the beginning of every year and work out a plan of action in terms of what their demands were going to be and how we would be prepared to meet those demands and what kind of challenges we would have from a standpoint of staffing, affordability, and so on and so forth. It's how well you know your business, know your capabilities, and know how you can meet the demands of clients. It's the nature of that business. Everything is urgent.
Yeah. And someone told me early in my career that to succeed in advertising, you have to have a high tolerance for ambiguity. And that has stuck in my head. And I've also found that's true in academia. That is stuck in my head. It's like things are vague, right? What makes advertising and strategic communication or creative industries in general so exciting is they're not banking, they're not finance. They are creative, and there's ambiguity, right? There is no magic formula. And there's also often a lot of ambiguity to one of the points you made, sir. There's a lot of ambiguity to the direction you will get from clients. They'll tell you something one day, and often they'll change direction the next day, and you have to be able to deal with that. One thing you mentioned also was how do you tolerate the rejection, having your ideas rejected? That's tough, and that's tough no matter what field you're in. And I think that the secret is if somehow you have to keep telling yourself that your idea is not you, right? If your idea is being rejected, you are not. It's not you that is being rejected. It's not your personality. It's not your brain. It's your idea. The thing of course, is that your idea feels like your baby. And it's like, the client killed my baby. That's what it always feels like. And you have to develop this toughness so that it doesn't always feel like your baby, or just the reality is that, you know, you just have to make a new baby tomorrow. I mean, it's kind of like that. It's kind of like that.
I'm going to give you an example of what happened to us 3 years ago in Tokyo with our summer study abroad program. We were working with McCann Erickson and a company called Mondelez, which is formerly Kraft International. And the brand that they gave us, the brands they gave us were 5 brands of chewing gum. Japan, the Japanese marketplace, the adults are one of the largest chewers of chewing gum in the world. I didn't know this. We were given a brief by Mondelez on the first day of our 2 weeks together, and the client came in and presented us with a 41-page brief. I was shocked. I'd never had this experience before, and I saw 26 students collapse, had no idea what they were going to do. But I can tell you that, and the client said, we are insistent that you address this brief, and we want answers and actionable plans at the end of 2 weeks. We found out that at the end of 2 or 3 days, we were able to cut through those 41 pages to 2 distinct action plans, and we were able to put it together and deliver a quality product. Two competing teams of students delivered 2 quality products to the client at the end of 2 weeks. In spite of all the pressures and all of the complications and all of the ambiguities, the briefing of this, just to tell you how complicated it was, the chewing gum market was in a state of decline in Japan. And what the client wanted to do was, in addition to the state of decline of the category, their 5 brands were also in a state of decline. And they wanted the students to come up with a campaign that would not only increase their own brand share, but also build the industry, the category. And they did it. And Mondelez actually put some of this advertising into the marketplace, and it was successful. These are examples that happen every day. That's just one typical example.
Thank you. There is a question from the audience, for online audience, for David. David, what is your opinion on using influencers in marketing? Is there any big difference between the US and Europe? I'm very glad for this question.
Influencers in marketing. I think there's always been influencers in marketing. I mean, I realize that the term is used in a new way now. And so now people are tweeting about, are being paid, let's say, to tweet or do a YouTube video or post on social media about a brand. I'm not sure that that's radically different than hiring a celebrity spokesperson to appear in your television commercial. It's still a famous person or a person who indeed is an influencer for whatever reason. So it never really struck me as a problem. What I don't love about it personally is that, well, this goes to some of the things about public relations that I often have an ethical problem with, is that when it's not clear that the person who is the influencer is in fact being paid, when the person is pretending that, oh, this is just my candid, unsolicited opinion. I just happened to tweet about Pepsi today just because I was in a Pepsi kind of mood. No. So that I just don't like. Personally, I just think there's an ethical issue there. I mean, I think we, as adults, as for the most part, as consumers of products, let's say as adult consumers, it's very different if we're talking to children. Children do not know the difference, up to a certain age, cannot distinguish between a paid message and something that's not, between a TV commercial and a TV program. But as adults, we know that people are paid in the world to make persuasive messages. We see them on television all the time. We see them online all the time. So I find it just disingenuous when people are pretending that they're not being paid to influence about a product. And just say it. I mean, that's I don't know enough about the use of influencers in marketing in Europe to comment on how it differs from the US. I just don't. So I'm not sure if anyone else does.
Thank you, David. I didn't pay David to answer like that because we've been one of the first departments that pushed this topic, that there is this ethical line that covered advertising is unethical on social media, and currently we're working on with Association of Advertising and other regulatory bodies to write an ethical code that on covered advertising. So that's my self-promo. Yeah, Sandy. You wanna?
So one of the, if you are trying to distinguish with the real difference between influencers and celebrity sponsors or things like that, generally influencers are considered to be like organically grown. So, you know, a celebrity is a celebrity from something, people are famous, and then you come to them like, now use our product. And generally an influencer, maybe someone has a YouTube channel where they do fashion, like, okay, I'm gonna do my hair every day, hopefully I become famous. And they start to grow a following because somebody likes, you know, people like their fashion tips, they like the way they speak. Eventually that person's YouTube channel hits a threshold. Usually it's like 10,000 followers or subscribers, and brands start looking at you like, huh? Who's this person who's got so many followers? What are they doing? So you're in the fashion, you're doing hair tips and stuff, and all of a sudden L'Oreal's like, hey, your eyebrows could use a little bit of this. Just, you know, hold it up, say L'Oreal, do your eyebrows, and there it goes. And I think that points directly to what you're saying. Now, I would say what I've noticed is the majority of influencers are very good about linking to their sponsors or branded content, as far as I've seen. It's actually in the States and in Europe, I've seen there's I don't get around to too many of these types of YouTube videos, Instagram accounts, but what I've seen from YouTube in the Czech Republic, there was a couple of fashion people, and then one guy, I don't know, he's an influencer, I don't know why, he just does his own life and people follow it. But they are generally okay with that. I wouldn't say that they are completely ignoring it. They're not pretending that they're, yeah, I just love L'Oreal so much, everyone else should. But I think in the US it is definitely judged more harshly. People are more used to spotting corporate shills, I guess you would say. So.
Unfortunately, we have time for the last question. So in between the time for the microphone, I would just add that the way to fight stress in case of Sandy, as far as I know, Sandy, besides he's been heading international advertising agencies all over the world, you know, spent his life with the family in Japan, Hong Kong, Philippines, wherever. So he's also a volunteer firefighter, and he owns a pilot license. So that's a way how to, you know, manage the stress.
It works.
So the last question, please.
So my question is mostly meant for Mr. Kornberg, and you mentioned earlier that when you were starting in Prague, you mostly had people with no former education in marketing in your office. What were the qualities you were looking for in them, and perhaps like is education in the field needed, or is it just an advantage?
At that time, as I said, there were very few. Most of the people that we interviewed, were Americans because there were so many of them. And we found that the young Czechs that we wanted to bring in because they expressed some interest really had no experience at all. And from that standpoint, with no experience, they decided that they really had no interest. So we had to really struggle to be able to, one, identify the right kind of people in terms of temperament, in terms of their experience, and a desire to really work very hard. And we also imported 4 or 5 people from other European countries, from the UK and from the States, to train the people on the job. It was basically on-the-job training. The other challenge was that we, as an agency, were also looking at clients that had virtually no experience. So it was a learning process to go, it was running and learning in parallel. As I said, they were really important pioneering days. It was wonderful to see how all this progressed. And the Czech marketplace, in my opinion, is one of the most sophisticated in terms of advertising in Europe that I know of. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
don't forget that people did not speak English.
That is really important. That's true.
Thank you.
Okay, so everybody, thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm very glad that you've been such a great audience. Thank you for your questions, and we're hoping to see you in the next Rozpravy. And again, I advertise Sandy's tomorrow's special lecture on Summer School of Marketing tomorrow at 12:30 in Hollar.
2 weeks this summer. We're going to do it 2 times, July and August. It will be something you'll never forget, for sure.
So let me thank David, Sandy, and Philip for being here tonight.